Breaking news out of Canberra, Australia. In a stunning geopolitical earthquake that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon just 18 hours ago, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has categorically rejected a $1.4 trillion American demand for exclusive rare earth mineral access, effectively ending 75 years of unquestioned military alliance cooperation. At exactly 9:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time last night, three senior White House officials confirmed what defense analysts are calling the most significant fracture in the ANZUS Treaty since its 1951 signing. We're talking about the minerals that power every single advanced weapons system in the American arsenal, 97% of which currently flow through Chinese-controlled supply chains, and Australia just told Washington it's choosing Beijing's partnership over American pressure. In the next 11 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Australia controls 63% of the world's high-grade rare earth deposits outside China, why Trump's emergency executive order demanding priority access backfired spectacularly, and what this means for American military readiness when the Pentagon's own wargame simulations show weapon systems failing within 16 months without these critical materials. Here's the question that should terrify every American watching this. If our oldest, most reliable ally in the Indo-Pacific just chose Chinese money over American security guarantees, what does that tell us about the collapsing credibility of United States global leadership? Let me paint you the picture. On March 15, 2025, at precisely 2:37 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, President Trump's national security team transmitted what they called a national defense priority requisition to the Australian government through classified diplomatic channels. The document, portions of which leaked to the Sydney Morning Herald within 6 hours, demanded that Australia immediately renegotiate existing rare earth export contracts with China and redirect 70% of current production to American defense contractors at prices 17% below current market rates. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, this would have forced Australian mining companies to absorb approximately $12 billion in breach of contract penalties with Chinese firms, while simultaneously accepting $4.6 billion in reduced revenue over the next 3 fiscal years. The demand cited emergency provisions in a little-known 1953 Defense Cooperation Memorandum that American officials argued gave Washington the authority to commandeer strategic resources during national security emergencies. But here's where the timeline gets critical. On March 17th, just 48 hours after receiving the American ultimatum, Prime Minister Albanese convened an emergency National Security Committee meeting that lasted 7 hours and included executives from Lynas Rare Earths, the world's largest non-Chinese processor, and Northern Minerals, which controls deposits worth an estimated $300 billion. By March 19th, Australia's response was delivered through diplomatic back channels, and according to Yale Law School's National Security Clinic, the language was diplomatically devastating. The Australian government formally rejected the American demand, citing sovereignty over natural resources and existing international trade obligations, but the real bombshell came in paragraph 7 of the 12-page response, where Canberra explicitly referenced its deepening rare earth partnership with China as an alternative framework for regional cooperation. So, how exactly does this work? And why are these specific minerals so critical that the Pentagon is scrambling emergency meetings as we speak? Think of rare earths like the specialized vitamins that keep the human body functioning. You can have all the major food groups, all the calories you need, but without specific trace minerals, entire bodily systems shut down. That's exactly the relationship between rare earth elements and modern weapon systems. According to the United States Geological Survey, 17 specific rare earth elements, including neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, are absolutely irreplaceable in the production of precision-guided munitions, fighter jet engines, satellite communication systems, and the electric motors that power everything from Virginia-class submarines to the latest generation of stealth aircraft. The F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, America's most advanced aircraft, requires approximately 427 kilograms of rare earth materials per unit. The Virginia-class submarine uses over 4,000 kilograms. When you calculate the Pentagon's current procurement pipeline through fiscal year 2030, we're talking about an immediate need for 68,000 metric tons of processed rare earths annually. Here's where Australia's rejection becomes catastrophic. Right now, China controls 87% of global rare earth processing capacity, but Australia holds the only significant high-grade deposits outside Chinese territory that can be brought to full production capacity within 36 months. The rare earth deposits in Western Australia's Mount Weld and the Browns Range project in the Northern Territory contain ore grades averaging 9.4% total rare earth oxides, compared to the global average of 3.1%, meaning Australian minerals require 63% less energy to process and generate 41% less toxic waste. American defense contractors have been quietly trying to diversify away from Chinese rare earth dependence since 2018. Investing over $7 billion in domestic mining projects in California, Texas, and Wyoming, but the Government Accountability Office reported in January 2025 that none of these projects will reach commercially viable production before 2029 at the absolute earliest. And even then, they'll only supply 22% of Pentagon requirements. And it gets worse when you look at the human faces behind this geopolitical chess match. Meet Richard Patterson, a 53-year-old senior procurement manager at Raytheon Technologies in Tucson, Arizona, who's been coordinating rare earth supplies for the production of SM-6 missiles, the backbone of American naval air defense. Richard has worked in defense procurement for 27 years, managing supply chains that he always assumed were secure because they involved American allies. On March 20th, 72 hours after Australia's rejection became known internally, Richard received an emergency directive from Pentagon acquisition officials warning that current rare earth inventories for neodymium iron boron magnets, critical for missile guidance systems, would be exhausted by September 20th, 2025, unless alternative sources could be secured immediately. The memo, which Richard shared with colleagues under condition of anonymity, projected that without Australian supplies to buffer against Chinese market manipulation, the unit cost for rare earth components in each SM-6 missile would increase by 47.3% within 6 months. Richard now faces an impossible choice. He can recommend paying Chinese suppliers premium prices that will blow through his department's entire annual budget by October, or he can recommend production slowdowns that will leave the Navy with inadequate missile inventories during what military planners consider the highest risk period for potential Taiwan Strait conflict in 40 years. The decision he makes in the next 60 days could determine whether American aircraft carriers have sufficient defensive capabilities during a crisis. Multiply Richard's nightmare by every single weapons system that depends on rare earths. But here's the kicker. Let's talk about Jennifer Nakamura, a 41-year-old electrical engineer at Lockheed Martin's Fort Worth facility, who specializes in the electrical systems for F-35 production. Jennifer has spent the past 9 years perfecting the integration of samarium cobalt magnets in the fighter's electric power generation and distribution systems. These specific magnets can withstand the extreme temperatures generated by the F-35's Pratt and Whitney engine while maintaining magnetic properties that are absolutely critical for power stability during combat maneuvers. On March 18th, Jennifer's entire department received notification that their primary supplier of samarium cobalt materials, which sources 78% of its raw samarium from Australian processed ores, was implementing a force majeure clause due to supply uncertainty. The company projected that existing samarium stocks would support current F-35 production rates only through July 25, 2025. For Jennifer, this isn't just a procurement problem, it's a professional crisis that could end her career. She's currently supervising the electrical systems integration for 47 F-35s destined for the Polish Air Force under a $12.6 billion foreign military sales contract that includes penalty clauses of $850,000 per day for late delivery. If samarium supplies are interrupted, Jennifer estimates that electrical system integration would be delayed by a minimum of 7 months per aircraft, generating penalties exceeding $280 million and potentially destroying Lockheed Martin's reputation with NATO allies who are watching America's ability to deliver on defense commitments. Jennifer told colleagues she's updating her resume because someone will be held accountable when this deal collapses. And it won't be the executives who ignored supply chain warnings for the past 4 years. And it gets worse when you hear about Marcus Thompson, a 37-year-old small business owner in Mountain Pass, California, who invested his entire family savings, $3.2 million, into reopening a rare earth processing facility that he believed would be supported by Pentagon procurement contracts as part of America's Supply Chain Independence Initiative. Marcus spent 18 months navigating Environmental Protection Agency permits, hiring 23 employees, and installing Chinese-manufactured processing equipment, ironically, because no American alternatives existed. His business plan, validated by a Department of Defense feasibility study in 2023, projected that he could supply 6.4% of the Pentagon's dysprosium requirements by fiscal year 2027, with guaranteed purchase contracts that would generate $18 million in annual revenue. On March 21st, Marcus received a devastating call from a Department of Defense contracting officer explaining that the guaranteed purchase agreements he was counting on were being suspended indefinitely because the Pentagon was prioritizing negotiations with larger-scale international suppliers in response to the Australia crisis. The officer explained off the record that Marcus's facility, even at full capacity, would supply less rare earths in an entire year than the Pentagon needs in 2 weeks, making his operation strategically irrelevant in the current emergency. Marcus now faces a nightmare scenario where he's invested everything in a business that the government encouraged, took on $4.7 million in debt to finance, and now discovers the Pentagon has abandoned small suppliers in favor of begging China for materials. His employees, many of whom left stable jobs in the California mining industry to join his venture, will likely be unemployed by June. Multiply Marcus's story by dozens of small American rare earth ventures that believed government promises about supply chain independence and are now realizing those commitments evaporate the moment a real crisis hits. Let me be crystal clear about what the experts are saying, because the timeline here should terrify anyone paying attention. According to a March 22nd analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Australia's rejection of American demands represents a fundamental realignment of Indo-Pacific resource politics that will have cascading effects far beyond rare earths. The report cites testimony from Dr. Eugene Goltz, a former senior Pentagon official, now at the University of Notre Dame, who told a congressional hearing in January that America's rare earth dependence represents the single greatest vulnerability in defense manufacturing. Quote, "We have built a military-industrial complex that cannot function without materials controlled by our primary strategic competitor, a situation unprecedented in American history." The Atlantic Council released emergency analysis on March 20th, projecting that if Australia maintains its rejection and China decides to restrict rare earth exports as retaliation for any future trade or Taiwan-related tensions, the Pentagon would face a choice between paying extortionate prices that could add $60 billion annually to weapons procurement costs or accepting production delays that would leave critical systems undermanned during potential conflict. Dr. Samantha Gross at the Brookings Institution published research indicating that China has been systematically expanding rare earth processing partnerships with Australia specifically to create leverage over American supply chains, investing over $47 billion in Australian mining infrastructure since 2021. Here's the timeline that defense analysts are watching. In the next 30 to 90 days, Pentagon procurement officials will attempt to negotiate emergency rare earth purchase agreements with Chinese state-owned enterprises, likely accepting prices 30 to 45% above current market rates and potentially including politically humiliating concessions about Taiwan policy or South China Sea territorial disputes. In the 6 to 12-month time frame, the Congressional Research Service projects that rare earth shortages will begin forcing production slowdowns in priority weapon systems, starting with complex platforms like the F-35 and Virginia-class submarines that have limited alternative sourcing options. But here's what really concerns analysts at the Rand Corporation: the permanent damage to American credibility with treaty allies. If Australia, the most reliable American partner in the Indo-Pacific, can reject American security demands in favor of Chinese economic partnerships, what signal does that send to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and other nations that rely on American defense guarantees? The research suggests we're witnessing the acceleration of what international relations scholars call hegemonic decline, where allies stop automatically aligning with American interests because they no longer believe Washington can deliver on promises or protect them from economic coercion by rising powers. Let me be crystal clear about the broader implications, because this isn't just about minerals in the ground. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco's March analysis of global supply chain vulnerabilities, rare earth dependence represents a microcosm of America's failed approach to strategic competition with China over the past 2 decades. While Washington was fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Beijing was systematically securing control over every critical mineral supply chain, from lithium to cobalt to rare earths, that would power 21st century technology and weapon systems. Dr. Nadia Shadlow, former Deputy National Security Advisor now at the Hudson Institute, argues that Australia's rejection reflects a cold calculation by Canberra that China's economic integration offers more tangible benefits than American security guarantees that increasingly look unreliable. She points to Pentagon war games conducted in 2024 that showed American forces running out of precision munitions within 3 weeks of a Taiwan conflict scenario, largely because rare earth supply disruptions would halt missile production while combat operations were still ongoing. The ultimate irony, according to Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies, is that Trump's aggressive demand for Australian rare earths, framed as America First resource security, has achieved exactly the opposite outcome, pushing Australia deeper into China's orbit and demonstrating to the world that American diplomatic leverage has collapsed even with its closest allies. Let's recap the 3 critical points that every American needs to understand about this crisis. First, who pays for this catastrophic failure in resource security strategy? It's not the politicians who ignored warnings, it's procurement managers like Richard Patterson facing impossible budget choices, engineers like Jennifer Nakamura, whose careers will be destroyed by delivery failures, and small business owners like Marcus Thompson, who believed government promises about supply chain independence. These are the Americans absorbing the human cost of decades of strategic negligence, while Chinese state planners celebrate their successful resource encirclement of American defense manufacturing. Second, the scale of this crisis is almost incomprehensible. $1.4 trillion in rare earth mineral access that the Pentagon desperately needs, controlled by an ally that just said no to American demands for the first time in 75 years. We're talking about 68,000 metric tons of irreplaceable materials annually, required for every advanced weapon system in the American arsenal, now subject to Chinese influence and pricing manipulation. The numbers reveal an American defense establishment that cannot function without the goodwill of the nation it's supposedly preparing to deter in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Third, the permanent consequence that should haunt every strategic thinker in Washington. This isn't a temporary supply disruption that can be fixed with emergency purchases or diplomatic pressure. This represents a fundamental shift in global power dynamics, where America's oldest allies are openly choosing Chinese economic partnerships over American security architecture, because they've calculated that Beijing's checkbook is more reliable than Washington's increasingly hollow promises. When Australia looks at American political chaos, collapsing infrastructure, spiraling debt, and military failures from Afghanistan to Ukraine, and decides that partnership with China offers more stability, that's not just a rare earth problem. That's an empire in terminal decline. If this analysis opened your eyes to the rare earth crisis and America's collapsing leverage with treaty allies, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm tracking every development in this unfolding disaster. Share this video with anyone who still believes American military dominance is secure, because the Pentagon's rare earth scramble reveals the uncomfortable truth that our weapon systems depend on materials we don't control, processed by nations we don't influence, in supply chains dominated by our primary strategic competitor. Here's what keeps me up at night. We've spent the past 20 years building the most technologically advanced military in human history. Aircraft that can evade any radar, missiles that can strike targets with 1-meter accuracy, submarines that can operate undetected for months, and we've made every single one of those systems dependent on 17 rare earth elements that China can cut off whenever Beijing decides the strategic moment has arrived. Australia's rejection isn't the beginning of this crisis. It's the moment when decades of warnings finally manifested in a diplomatic humiliation that reveals American power isn't what we thought it was. And the nations we counted as permanent allies have been quietly calculating their options in a world where Chinese economic gravity is pulling harder than American security promises.